Thank you so much for your kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. And before we start, I wanted to ask you all to give another big warm welcome to Samuel Ross.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
So I'm very excited, Samuel, that we can do this conversation here.
Indeed.
I followed your work for many years, and as always, you know, it's part of the research to ask practitioners, artists, designers, whom I should look at in a young emerging generation. And Virgil Abloh was really the first one who told me about you and said I should see your work. Also Grace Wales-Bonner, with whom we've just opened a show at Serpentine Galleries in London. We invited Grace Wales-Bonner, your friend, to curate the show. So I'm delighted that we can do the first interview here at DLD. And I wanted to ask you to begin with the beginning, because you are the founder and the creative director of your own brand, The Cold Wall. It's great you found time to come to Munich in such a busy week, because you presented actually this week your new collection in Paris. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about how it all began and how you as an artist and as a writer started to begin your own brand in fashion.
Sure. I mean, well, I have a slightly storied background within fashion communication, and I'd worked in the field for around, I'd say, 4 to 5 years for a series of other high fashion brands. And what I learned after that period was that I had a yearning to encapsulate multiple forms of communication and to really have a social tinge and layer of thought process throughout what I wanted to introduce into the fashion world and community. So A Cold Wall started off primarily as a think piece, a 1,500-word small dissertation on some of the societal issues and disparities and realities that I often saw people facing within inner city London, and often, these moments were also implicated into other macro cities across the world, such as LA and New York and Paris. And The Cold Wall really talks about the tension, the folding and the cleaving of working class societal issues, amalgamating with upper middle to middle class conversations. And London, for me, has always been a basis for that. The city oozes the idea of melting pot culture through architecture, through sound, through experience design, through geography, through beautiful parks. And I wanted to take that energy and produce garments and have a narrative alongside those garments which were able to encapsulate that energy. I wanted to talk about, the kids who had grown up in Brixton, as well as the individual who had grown up in Islington, and both of those experiences being valued.
And also brutalism plays a key role from the beginning. I was friends with Peter, and Alison Smithson, who of course are kind of architectural proponents of brutalism. We had many conversations here actually at DLD with the legendary late Zaha Hadid about brutalism, and she talked about a kind of a human brutalism.
Indeed.
How to use concrete in a very human way. Can you tell us a little bit about what brutalism means in your work, the influence, but also the choice of materials within your own work?
Yeah, I mean, for me, brutalism, it has this ability to capture I'd say a tension and a coarseness that I feel oozes throughout working class England. Having grown up in estates and areas which really were part of the 1950s post World War II rush, and the influx of brutalism being placed in these areas, there is an emotional tie I have with brutalism which comes more from experience, more so being placed within the sandbox rather than looking upon the sandbox. So for me, these materials have such a value that it's almost my duty, having lived through these infrastructures, to replicate them in the form of fabrications and to tell those untold stories that these structures and environments have seen. And it's not just an emotional factor which has led to this, it's also the reality that my background and degree is in graphic design with contemporary illustration. I then went on to practice as a product designer before moving into advertising. So it's almost in my DNA to convert these experiences and place them into not just products, but tangible forms of communication. And of course, there's simply a love for brutalism, but it's more so a commercial and emotional factor that has led me to really embrace the idea of brutalism and that material story.
And how would you describe, because there's something incredible happening in London right now, in terms of fashion. There is an amazing energy. I used to live in Paris in the 90s, and a similar thing happened there in the art world, with Dominique Gonzalez-Foerster and Pierre Huyghe and Philippe Perrin. You had a generation of artists who were in very close contact, kept collaborating.
Yes.
And I feel right now that in London something similar is happening, with fashion. It's Grace Wales-Bonner, it's you, it's Craig Green. There's just so much creativity, so much invention, and there is also a great solidarity. It's an incredibly optimistic situation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Indeed, I feel like London's in this period when it comes to fashion communication, which feels incredibly holistic. It feels like we're in this nucleus at the moment, and there's this great relationship that the artists you mentioned, the designers you mentioned, we all have these dialogues and these conversations. It's very much I'd say the old, more so conservative idea of isolation has been broken down, and there's a real awareness that we're going through a fashion renaissance in London, and you see it through the social connotations that are being poured throughout these collections. It's not just about the clothing, it's about the clothing being a vessel for a narrative, and it's about the show experience being a vessel for communication. And there's this real awareness to talk about renewability, sustainable issues we're facing, social issues we're facing, identity being a real talking point. It's key, and it's very interesting to see that with such a supportive lens through one another. There's no sense of separation. It's very holistic. And
for your generation, of course, also, social media plays a key role. So I wanted to ask you about that and how important it is for your work and, the way you kind of approach the marketing also of your brand. What's the role of social media within your world?
As social media is really it's much more than a speakerphone. It's more so a visual dissertation, where I can use more than words to convey an opinion, or use more than words, or specifically one format of communication to speak to an audience. It gives you the ability to use, for example, moving image and sound overlaid to convey what could be, a racial tension or disparity, which couldn't have existed before. And what also social media does is it opens up a wider lens in who you can speak to, and that is it's incredibly intrinsic to the process of a Cold War. As I mentioned earlier, it's not just about clothing specifically, it's more so about macro communication and being able to harness the visual aspect or the sound experience. And these isolated moments which embody the work that I create, once you take those onto social media and you amalgamate them together, you can create this rich saturation. And there's a layer of entertainment there, which is incredibly important too. The reality is social media has taken up a space which was occupied by radio and was occupied by TV and film. So being able to amalgamate all of those components and experiences, it feels like it's not solely the future, but it plays a huge part in it now and how we communicate.
And of course, there is also the performative aspect in your work. Coming from the art world, I'm very interested in your shows being kind of performances. It's a form of performance art, which appeals to all the senses. Can you talk a little bit about a Cold War as performance art?
Sure. It goes back to the initial concepts of a Cold War to really be a think piece about the realities of the world that we live in, specifically these inner city areas. And it's, for me, really about making sure the experience of a Cold War is never pinholed down specifically just to clothing. So as Han mentioned, the installation runways, which is a term that I've coined, are really based on sensory deprivation. So for example, if you were to come into a Cold War runway show, you'd be past sound plugs, you'd be past a clear pair of acetate glasses, because there will be concrete bellowing throughout the runway space. There will be a drop in temperature by about 10 degrees. There'll be moving art in the form form of dancers who are cladded, let's say, in concrete, and you experience this syncopation of, let's say, 20 dancers all cladded in concrete moving throughout the runway space. So there's this study on form and structure and architecture in the form of the human body and clothing.
And survival also, no? There is a kind of there are nightmarish moments, there are also moments of survival.
It's harrowing. And I think that speaks to, once again, the brutalist connotations, the preconceived ideas to what concrete and what pebble dash represent, and those being key color palettes, that needs to be reflected in the experience. It's not just the material concrete, it's what would concrete be if it was a soundtrack, if it was audible? What would it be if it was a temperature? What would the mood of concrete be? These channels of thought are really pushed and personified through the Occult runway shows.
And how would you say, because we were with Virgil Abloh a couple of weeks ago, doing a panel in Miami, and it was interesting. It involved Takashi Dyson and also actually Arthur Jafa, and then the architects Francis Queré and Grace. And basically, Virgil talked a lot about social sculpture, and that idea also of basically streetwear being a form of social sculpture. He even talked about this idea that it might be a form of urbanism, about making cities. We discussed, it was a panel with Terme and, related to the Serpentine and related to Calle issue of Arthur Jafa. And suddenly it turned actually into a panel about inventing the city of the future. And, streetwear as urbanism, streetwear as social sculpture. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I definitely think there's now, streetwear is, and the T-shirt, the basic jersey T-shirt, will always be the voice of, the new generation. And that's something that has really, it was birthed in the 60s, and it's such a staple in communication. And those ideas and slogans and typographic nuances moving throughout a geographic, moving through the geography of a city, they become vessels of information. And I feel like this new movement in streetwear that Virgil has brought about, and that I also embrace, we're highly aware that there's a social connotation behind even the simplest graphic, and that the reach of that graphic placed on a child or onto a teenager or a young adult through the city can bleed and speak to so many more people than it initially was on the basis of that purchase.
And so Virgil wants to build a city, and that's kind of the yet unrealized project. What are your unrealized projects or dreams? Where are you taking it from here to the next step?
I mean, for me, I've started the next process in my channel of 4, which is in the form of large-scale sculpture. Once again, focused on the ideas of brutalism and raw materials such as concrete, pebble dash, resin. Also looking at inflatable marble sculptures, which it's more tongue-in-cheek, but it plays on the idea of like a falsified form of luxury. So for me, as I've continued to develop in the runway shows, the installation art will eventually stand alone, and it will form sculpture. Also, I'm interested in the idea of physical syncopation, so how audio can convey a different experience that can't be actualized physically. So, for example, how do you convey the ideas of tension and fear and compression in an audible format, and how do you pair that with a physical narrative? For example, the form of a maze. How do those two overlay, and how do you get the most out of those experiences? And how do you bring communication that isn't just, communication has to be multifaceted, and that's where I see the latest workings that I'm working on going to.
And in this, multifaceted universe of yours, there is another dimension we haven't talked about yet, which I think is kind of important to address, which is the sonic dimension, the aspect of sound. And that's, the case also for example, Grace West-Banner. She works with, basically Chino Amobi works with Blood Orange. There's a lot of lots of collaborations with music, and you have a very strong relationship to sound. The sort of idea of, the space, the sound of space. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and also you actually do your own sound. You were telling me before that you've developed your own soundtracks.
Indeed.
What is the sonic dimension of a Cold War?
So it's interesting because, a Cold War has such like a robust and emotionless outwards pouring, I'd say. That the brand is very coarse. And sound seems to add something that is intrinsically holistic and human, and also has a spiritual value to it of some sort, which can't really be put into words. And it allows me to have this emotional pull and deliver an emotional experience to the viewers of installation. And also through social media, sound can almost cut through the layers of disconnection between the viewer and the phone and the content. So for me, it's almost like a form of holistic communication. Now, the actual sound itself varies between heavy, slow and drony bass lines and piercing synths. Some parts of that may be unlistenable. It's more so based on like the concept of how sound can be used to reflect what is being viewed than sound that is necessarily to be listened back and enjoyed. It's much more of a soundscape and a sound experience.
And yesterday we spoke with Catalina Garcia, who is also here with us today. And Catalina was talking about inspirations, for her art. We also spoke to Bob Greenberg, who talked about inspirations of his practice. I always think it's interesting. I mean, Panofsky said the future is invented with fragments from the past. I was kind of curious, of course, Virgil was somehow your mentor. We already spoke about that. But can you talk a little bit about influences from art, from fashion, from music,
Sure.
Your heroes, your heroines?
Sure. So Massimo Vannelli is a hero of mine, and he kind of, he transcended, similar to me, from the practice of graphic design and visual communication into, a multitude of fields which were based on, of course, industrial design, city mapping, furniture design. Anthony Caro, his work has heavily influenced me, actually, now that I'm moving into sculpture. He had the ability to capture quite an abstracted emotional mood overlaid with the sensitivity of his color palette. To me, it's very interesting. When I look at Anthony Caro's work, what I see is almost like a frozen frame out of a time lapse. And his use of material, die-cast metals, iron, juxtaposing and placing these sculptures into moments of serene really captures this I'd say this buoyancy that you see between London and the neighbouring countryside. Rachel White-Reed is another one who heavily influences me for obvious reasons. Her focus on negative space within architecture and a play on resin and concrete has clearly shown in my work. Who else is there that really... Fela Kuti, another one. I touched on the spirituality of music, and there's something within the cooking of his music. He produces these long experiences which last up to 18 to 22 minutes, and there's something about that stirring and cooking and seasoning which is so human. Those are, I'd say, the artists at the moment that really speak to me. In terms of, I touched on it with Anthony Caro, but in terms of color intelligence, Albers has been a huge influence from
So you look into color theory?
Color theory is phenomenal. It's so interesting to me. I'm still, of course, in a stage of learning, but Albers and Caro, I'd say, are the two out of that bunch that really really get me going,
It's of course the centenary, particularly in Germany, all museums celebrate the centenary of the Bauhaus, and that brings back also the color theory of Itten. There's a lot of discussion about color theory. One thing also which is interesting is the notion of the book, because, I'm obsessed by books, and of course they play a big role in art. Artists, often make artist books, but we often underestimate that actually books are very important in fashion. I had long meetings with the late Azedine Alaya always, in his magical house. And Alaya, hated kind of a lot of books published on him, but the books he really liked were the books he was involved, almost like an artist book. He layouted, and I think it's true for many fashion designers. They get very involved with their own book. And you've done an amazing book. For those of you who haven't seen it, it's urgent. You all look at Samuel's book. It's called Phase 1. archive book. It's really a catalogue of the development a Cold War went through. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about this book and the importance of the book as a medium.
Sure. So it's a large-scale hardback book which sits just over the size of A3, and it's 250 pages comprised of my thoughts, intimate images of the process, and the slipstream and time-lapse. I'm often questioned about how did a Cold War reach, to the point of being, winning LVMH and Andam Awards and British Fashion Awards so quickly. And this book really encapsulates the physicality, and it almost exposes a process and an ongoing of, the artist entering into the fashion sphere. Of course, I didn't go to fashion school. I went to design school. So it really forms almost as a form of communication, but a blueprint to the younger generation in how you can operate as a free-form artist in our age. Because this is something that I would have loved to receive from contemporaries and individuals I looked up to. So it's incredibly important to capture those moments and to not focus on the veneer which is placed onto the ceiling, but really look at the nuts and bolts of that process and the individuals involved in it. And it's, as you said, it's incredibly hands-on producing your first publication. You care about the font size, you care about the sensibilities of the page ordering, but more so it's almost like I like to see it as like a spirit guide to the younger generation into what it takes to convey an art project and bring that into macro culture or into the mainstream.
And of course, you've also done, Rainer Maria Rilke wrote a little book to advise to a young poet. You've already done your list. I found it online of an advice to students. And I wanted to end with that, to ask you a little bit to tell us about these different advices. Keep putting work out there. Don't be afraid to reach out to your idols. That's very important, I think.
Indeed. No? Like in this day and age, we have the ability to actually communicate quite easily, and we need to take advantage of that. And
yeah, we have a minute.
That's beautiful. That's part of the sound experience, by the way. it's this idea of being able to communicate and collaborate and really frame a generation. I think that needs to be at the top of everyone's mind. When we look back at previous art and design movements, we've never had this overlay of easy communication, and that needs to be the focus, which is why I often tell peers there are more than mantras than just doing. You need to communicate, you need to talk. The idea of oneself reaching a point needs to be dissolved. It's about macro communication and cross-pollination of ideas. That's how we usher in the new age of art, communication and design.
There could not be a better conclusion. Samuel, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Big applause for Samuel Ross.
Thank you for having me here.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you. So these are the shoes that I developed with Nike last year. And the whole idea was to have a notion of educating a consumer that may know me more so for the streetwear basis, but not for the art and design side. So having this brutalist structure on the back of the shoe forces a conversation with the user, because they ask, what is it made from? And indeed, and the whole premise and idea behind the shoe was to create an object that was living. So removing UV and PU coatings from the shoe, allowing the shoe to age. Once again, creating something more human and a bit more holistic, but also, once again, celebrating the idea of product design and almost Dadaism as well, a slight eccentricness to it.
I love it. A shoe is a communication piece.
It feels modern, it does. Thank you.
My shoes.
I've seen these. These are beautiful. They're renewable pairs.
And they're from Ocean Plastic.
Indeed, amazing pair. Do you want to swap?
Such a great idea.
Indeed.
The DLD shoe swap. Samuel, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hans.